either at the margins or in the tissue spaces along the wound path.
Doctor,
I might say,
incidentally,
when I describe wounds or forensic pathologists describe wounds, we may say that we may describe injuries and specify where injuries appear to be post-mortem. I mean, that's characteristic. If we find a wound that appears to be inflicted post-mortem, we would specifically state that. And contrary to that, when we see vital activity, we generally describe bleeding in the wound or in the wound path or in the tissue spaces along the wound to substantiate that they occurred during life.
Dr. Golden, with regard to the figure in the lower left-hand portion of the diagram marked as Peoples 25 for identification, does that figure indicate some sort of wound or trauma to the right side of Nicole Brown Simpson's head?
If we're referring to the red marking here, yes.
And what did you find during the course of your autopsy that indicated such a wound or trauma?
Well, I'm referring to my report to refresh memory, but there was a bruise on the right side of the scalp, 4 inches directly above the ear canal. And after a shaving of the scalp, it was 1 by 1 inch. It was a fresh bruise. It was red-violet in color. No other injury was apparent, meaning no abrasion or laceration. And this bruise, on subsequent examination, disclosed bruising beneath the scalp. Correction on that, fresh bruising beneath the scalp.
Would that indicate to you, sir, that this was an antemortem wound?
Yes, this was an antemortem wound. It was associated with a deep scalp bruise.
Inflicted, consequently, while Nicole Brown Simpson was still alive. Is that correct?
Yes.
And inferentially, before she received the gaping incised wound across the neck. Is that correct?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have another diagram that I would like to have marked. It pertains to the autopsy of Nicole Brown Simpson. It reflects 3 wounds to the scalp. May this be Peoples 26 for identification?
Yes.
Dr. Golden, during the course of your autopsy upon the body of Nicole Brown Simpson, did you observe wounds or trauma to the scalp of Nicole?
Yes.
Okay. Tell us what you observed, sir.
There was a cutting wound on the back of the scalp, left side. Which, and I'm referring to my report, particularly the addendum report on Nicole Brown Simpson. It's a 1 1/4 inch length, diagonally oriented cutting wound, tapered above, and this doesn't reflect it as well. The diagram doesn't reflect the actual appearance as the photograph would, but it's a 1 1/4 inch long cutting wound. It was longer than deep. It went into the scalp for approximately 3/8 to 1/2 inch and did no further damage to the skull.
This was not a fatal wound, I take it?
No.
Was it an antemortem wound, that is one that was inflicted before Nicole Brown Simpson died?
Yes, this wound was associated with fresh scalp hemorrhage. In other words, bleeding in the deep scalp tissues.
Now, Dr. Golden, there were 2 other wounds that you observed with regard to Nicole Brown Simpson's scalp. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, would
There
you
was
just,
a cutting wound or stab wound superficially right in the posterior parietal occipital, in other words, lower down here on the right side of the lower scalp. This was a 1/2 inch in length superficial wound, only going in, again, 3/8 to 1/2 inch, a non-fatal wound.
was it also?
There was a small amount of hemorrhage associated. Again, that occurred before death. It was an antemortem injury.
Okay, thank you, doctor. And just for purposes of the record, you were indicating a wound roughly in the center of the head, midway between the ears on People's 26 for identification.
Yes.
Doctor, there was a third wound. Would you briefly describe that wound for us and indicate whether or not it was antemortem, perimortem, or postmortem?
Well, that was an antemortem cutting wound, 3/16 of an inch in length, involving the skin only, with a small amount of deep scalp hemorrhage. Again, it's antemortem. It was a superficial cutting wound of the scalp.
And you're indicating on the diagram, People's 26 for identification, a wound closest to the left ear as depicted on the diagram. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, doctor, during the course of your autopsy as performed upon Nicole Brown Simpson's body, did you notice any injuries to her hands?
Yes.
Tell us about that, sir.
Well, okay, referring to my notes, my autopsy notes and protocol to refresh my memory. On the index finger on the right index finger, there was a 5/8 inch long cut of the skin adjacent to the distal knuckle. Involved the skin only, and it had was a tangential cut, which would indicate that it was shelved. In other words, it didn't go in straight. It was an oblique cut, which would indicate shelving or a tangential cut.
And so what is the distal knuckle?
The one closest to the fingertip. Proximal, distal. Proximal is closer to the. Proximal would be closer to the hand, and distal would be closer to the fingertip.
I see. Okay. Would you briefly describe the other wounds to Nicole Brown Simpson's hands that you observed?
A few minor injuries. Punctate abrasion on the ring finger of the right hand. On the left hand, there was a punctate abrasion, base of the right ring finger. And finally, there was a 1/2 inch superficial skin cut on the top of the left hand.
Dr. Golden, are you familiar with the term defense wounds?
Yes.
What are defense wounds, sir?
Defense wounds are injuries on the upper extremities, either the arms or the hands, which would occur when the victim raises the extremities to protect the body or to ward off or grab the instrument, or to ward off or fend off the blow by an assailant.
Sir, in your opinion, were any of the wounds to Nicole Brown Simpson's hands compatible with defense wounds?
Yes.
And why is that, sir?
The cut on the right index finger is in a characteristic location for a defense wound on the palmar or volar surface of the finger, which could indicate an attempt to fend off the weapon or to grab the weapon, and the superficial cutting wound on the top of the hand that I described could also be construed as a defense wound. It's a superficial cut, but could also indicate a defensive motion to attempt to ward off I don't want to say blow, to ward off the weapon that was inflicting the injuries.
Dr. Golden, at the conclusion of the autopsy that you performed upon Nicole Brown Simpson's body, did you form an opinion as to the cause of her death?
Yes.
What was your opinion, sir?
She died as a result of the sharp force injuries, which includes the cutting wound and the stab wound. So they're grouped as sharp force injuries.
And that would include the wounds most specifically depicted and as characterized by your testimony in People's 25 for identification. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, Dr. Golden, later in the morning, on June 14th, 1994, you performed an autopsy upon the body of an individual identified to you as Ronald Goldman. Is that correct?
Yes.
And prior to performing the autopsy procedures, did you examine the body and determine that it was clothed?
Yes.
And would you describe how Mr. Goldman's body was clothed when you first observed it?
Okay, I'll also refer to my autopsy protocol, but he was wearing a long sleeve type of shirt or sweater that was extensively bloodstained and moist at the time that I examined it. And he was also wearing a pair of bloodstained Levi jeans and 2 canvas type boots and 2 sweat socks.
Sir, with regard to the shirt, did you examine it for any evidence of cuts or slits or tears?
Yes, I did.
What did you find?
On the front or lower right side, there was a 1.5 inch long slit-like tear. Lower right sleeve, a 1 inch slit-like tear. On the back, lower side of the back, there is a 1/2 inch slit-like tear.
And sir, with regard to Mr. Goldman's jeans, did you find any evidence of a slit, tear, or cut in that item of clothes?
Yes, on the jeans, on the outside of the left hip region, there was a 1.5 inch long slit.
And Dr. Goldman, as part of your autopsy procedure, was the clothing removed from Mr. Goldman's body and preserved?
Yes.
After the clothing was removed, Dr. Goldman, did you determine the length of Mr. Goldman's body?
Yes.
And what was that, sir?
69 inches or 5 feet 9 inches.
And Dr. Goldman, did you also determine the weight of Mr. Goldman's body?
Yes, 171 pounds.
Doctor, did you observe injury to the neck area of Ronald Goldman?
Yes.
And starting with the front of the neck, did you observe any evidence of injury to the front of the neck?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have here a diagram pertaining to Ronald Goldman's autopsy. It reflects wounds to the front of the neck as well as to the right side of the face and as to the left side of the neck. May that be People's 27 for identification?
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Goldman, People's 27 for identification is a diagram that you prepared in the course of the autopsy you performed upon Ronald Goldman's body. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And during the course of that autopsy, did you observe what appeared to be 2 parallel incised wounds on the front of Mr. Goldman's neck?
Yes, I did.
Would you describe those in more detail for us, sir, and make reference to the diagram People's 27 for identification as you do so?
Okay, I'll also use the autopsy report and the addendum report. Basically, at the there was a transverse superficial cutting wound at the level of the superior border of the larynx, or voice box, 3 inches in length, and it on the left side it went within 1/2 inch of the of another injury of the left side of the neck to be described later, and it went transversely across the front of the neck to the right side to the right anterior side of the neck.
How deep was that particular wound, Dr. Goldman?
It was deeper on the left, where it went down through the skin and dermis to the fascia, the connective tissue beneath the dermis and overlying the muscle. It became more superficial on the right.
Was that a deep wound?
I've already described it, Steph. It went down to the fascia on the left and tapered to the skin on the right. It was not a fatal wound.
And what are the fascia?
Fascia is the connective tissue, the flat sheets of connective tissue beneath in the tissue planes. Here would be the covering, the superficial fascia overlying the muscles of the neck.
And doctor, this particular incised wound was not fatal in and of itself. Is that correct?
No, it was not.
Was it inflicted ante-mortem, that is, before fatal wounds were inflicted upon Mr. Goldman?
Yeah.
Again, just for the sake of the record, and I hate to bring this up, from where I'm sitting, it appears that the doctor from time to time at least refreshes his memory.
I think many times he has told us. It looks like you are looking at your report again to answer the question.
Yes.
Okay.
There was a small amount of tissue hemorrhage associated with that wound.
And with regard to your indications to the diagram here, you are referring to the upper leftmost figure on People's 27 for identification. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, doctor, during the course of your autopsy, did you also observe a second incised wound below the larynx and parallel to the one you've just described?
Yes.
Describe that for us, please.
That was below the first wound, referring to my notes. It was horizontally oriented. It was parallel to the first wound, 6 inches in length. Starting on the left side of the neck, it was superficial, excuse me, involving the skin only, and it went around to the right side of the neck.
Did it angulate upwards?
It went to the right side of the neck, and although it's not shown here, it then angulated upward towards another wound on the right side of the neck to be described below.
Was this wound fatal in and of itself?
No, this wound was superficial, and I've indicated it involves the skin. It involves the skin only. It was a superficial cutting wound.
And how would you characterize this wound in terms of being antemortem, perimortem, or postmortem?
I believed it to be antemortem, inasmuch as there was a small amount of visible dermal, meaning skin hemorrhage, when I first saw it.
Now, doctor, referring to the lower right-hand figure on People's 27 for identification, does that particular figure depict some evidence of injury to the left side of Mr. Goldman's neck and head that you observed during the course of your autopsy?
Yes, it does.
Now, using your pointer, sir, and taking the lowermost wound, would you describe what you found with regard to that wound when you conducted your autopsy upon Mr. Goldman's body?
Well, there was a large gaping sharp force injury on the left side of the neck, 3 inches in length, which I'm pointing to right here.
Indicating the lowermost apparent sharp force wound in red on the diagram. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, would you tell us something about the wound path of that particular wound?
Okay. And of course, I'm refreshing my memory. It was on the left side of the neck, began at the level of the mid-larynx, cut through the sternocleidomastoid muscle, and it went through the skin and the muscle with bleeding along the path, and basically it severed the left internal jugular vein. There was extensive bleeding in the adjacent tissue, and I determined that to be the pathway of that wound.
Did that wound transect or sever any major blood vessels?
Yes, as I stated, it transected the left internal jugular vein.
Now, there was a second wound to the left side of Mr. Goldman's head, is that correct?
Yes.
Describe that for us, please, in brief.
The second wound was above it, behind the left ear. There's a gaping wound, 2 inches in length. The lower borders were irregular or ragged, and as I mentioned, it was 2 inches in length. Along the tissue planes, it appeared to be separated from the lower one by approximate distance of 4 inches. So those two wounds shared common areas of injury.
Are you saying that the two wound paths intersected with regard to those two wounds?
Yes, they met, they met deep along the tissue planes. So basically, you say they communicated or they shared common areas of injury.
Taking those two wounds together, doctor, are they fatal wounds? Either one or both or together? Also taking into consideration that the jugular vein on that side was severed?
Well, one or either or together, it's a fatal injury because of the severing of the left internal jugular vein.
And doctor, with regard to those two wounds, were they antemortem, perimortem, or postmortem?
No, as I've described, there was extensive hemorrhage along the wound path and in the tissue spaces.
Now, doctor, I realize that there are more lesser wounds that were not indicated on your diagram, but I would like to move ahead now to the lower left-hand figure on people's 27 for identification. And, sir, you observed during the course of your autopsy 5 wounds to the right side of Mr. Goldman's face. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it appears that we have 4 of those 5 wounds marked in red on that lower left-hand figure on people's 27 for identification. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, would you in brief, describe those wounds for us, sir.
Okay, and referring to my notes, these were superficial cuts, varying in orientation, involving the skin of the right cheek, and they varied from approximately 1/2 to 1 inch in maximal length.
And these 5 wounds, sir, were non-fatal, is that correct? In and of themselves?
No, correction, actually, yes, I said 1/2 to 1, it's, referring to my protocol. They were small cuts. They varied from 1/4 inch in length to 5/8 of an inch in length. These
All to-
superficial cuts on the right side of the cheek.
All to the right side of the cheek, is that correct?
Yes.
And were all of those antemortem wounds, as far as you can determine?
Yes, they were.
Now, doctor, during the course of your autopsy, you observed injury to the right side of Mr. Goldman's neck, did you not?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have another diagram pertaining to Mr. Goldman's autopsy. It depicts wounds to the right side of the neck. May that be People's next in order 28.
Yes.
Now, Dr. Golden, with regard to the lower left-hand figure depicted on People's 28 for identification,
Yes.
you observed some wounds in that area of Mr. Goldman's body, is that correct?
Yes, I did.
Would you describe those wounds for us, please?
Right, and referring to the report and the addendum, on the right side of the neck, 3 inches below the external auditory canal, there was a stab wound, 5/8 of an inch in length, and one end was pointed, the other end was Y-shaped or forked. And basically, the wound path was through the skin, subcutaneous tissue, did not strike a major artery or vein. And this wound connected or shared common area of injury with another wound on the right side of the neck above it, which was below and behind the right ear, behind the sternocleidomastoid muscle, and that was a 2-inch long wound with a 1-inch long superficial cut of the skin above it. And as you indicate here, the wound that I've just described, the deeper wound, intersected the superficial cut of the front of the neck, which we described earlier, which went around to the right side and then angled upward, and intersected that wound. So that's why it has that peculiar configuration there.
And sir, when you're referring to that superficial incised wound, that was on a previous diagram what appeared to be a superficial incised cut which moved across above the larynx and then intersected with this wound as depicted on People's 28, is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, Dr. Golden, with regard to these wounds that you just described in your testimony, were these wounds fatal in and of themselves?
All that I've described on the right side of the neck were not fatal, as I've described earlier. No major artery or vein was cut or incised, and that includes the jugular and the common carotid artery.
Dr. Golden, although not depicted on this particular diagram, did you observe abrasions to the right side of Mr. Goldman's face?
Yes?
And in brief, describe what you observed with regard to the pattern of abrasions that you observed.
Well, these are not depicted. So I'll have to refer to my notes, particularly on the addendum. There are multiple abrasions or scrapes on the right side of the face, extending from the, basically extending from the temporal region down to the right cheek, and from the, going as far forward as the lower eyelid and back to the front of the ear. Basically, the area covered was 4.5 by 2.5 inches, and they were linear, some diagonally oriented, some vertically. The area that they covered, namely the abrasions, also circumscribed the area of the superficial cutting wounds of the right cheek that I described earlier.
Those are the 5 cutting wounds you testified to?
Yes. So I had 2 things visible there: the multiple abrasions on the cheek, and then the circumscribed area which contained the cutting wounds, the superficial cutting wounds.
And sir, with reference to the diagram People's 28 for identification, you're indicating an area on the figure in the lower left-hand side, is that correct?
Yes?
Now, with regard to those abrasions, would you characterize those abrasions as antemortem, perimortem, or postmortem?
I would not characterize them as postmortem. They appeared to be perimortem, based on their color.
And again, perimortem meeting?
At about the time of death, which could be shortly before, at the time of, or shortly thereafter.
Now, doctor, during the course of your autopsy, you observed a number of various small incised wounds to the right and left ears of Mr. Goldman, is that correct?
Yes.
And did you also observe injuries to the scalp of Ronald Goldman?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have another diagram pertaining to Mr. Goldman's autopsy. May that be People's 29 for identification?
Yes.
Dr. Golden, with reference to People's 29 for identification, does that diagram, particularly the figure in the lower right-hand corner, depict the approximate locations of scalp wounds you observed on Mr. Goldman's head during the course of your autopsy?
Yes, it does.
Were each of those wounds non-fatal?
Yes, that's correct.
And did they all appear to be antemortem in nature?
Yes, they did.
And with regard to the dimensions of the wounds, no, I'll withdraw that. Now, Dr. Golden, during the course of your autopsy, you also observed what appeared to be stab wounds to the torso of Mr. Goldman's body. Is that correct?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have here another diagram depicting apparent stab wounds to the right side of the torso and the left thigh. May that be People's 30 for identification?
Yes.
Dr. Golden, with reference to People's 30 for identification and the figure which appears at the left-hand side of the diagram, are there depicted the approximate locations of 3 stab or cutting wounds that you observed on Mr. Goldman's body during the autopsy that you performed?
Yes.
And again, these wounds are numbered for reference purposes only and do not necessarily mean the order in which they were inflicted. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And Dr. Golden, starting with wound number 1, as indicated on People's 30 for identification, Would you describe that wound for us, please?
That depicts a stab wound on the right side of the chest. Excuse me. Did you want a description of each wound, or just what they are?
I would like a description of each wound, starting with the wound that you have numbered as number 1.
All right. That was a stab wound on the right side of the chest, 5/8 of an inch in length, with a rounded or blunt end on the lower end, and this wound went into the chest through the right 7th rib into the chest cavity. There was approximately 100-200 ml of blood in the chest cavity, and further dissection disclosed that the wound perforated the right lung and continued forward and terminated, or the wound path terminated on the front of the rib cage, where I found a 3/4 inch cut on the posterior aspect or back of the right 4th rib. So after estimating the total length of the wound path was 4 inches.
Now, doctor, when you say ml, you're referring to milliliters, are you not?
Yes.
Was the length of this particular wound approximately 5/8 of an inch?
The measurement on the skin was 5/8 of an inch, yes.
And in your opinion, sir, was this wound consistent with having been inflicted by a single-edged knife?
Yes, this one had the configuration of a single-edged blade. It had the wound had a blunt or squared off end and a pointed or tapered end.
Was this a fatal wound, doctor?
This wound perforated the lung and caused hemorrhage into the right chest cavity, and is considered a fatal wound. It should also be noted there was another stab wound also into the right side of the chest, which also injured the lung.
We're going to talk about that second stab wound in just a second, doctor. It's just one more question with regard to stab wound number 1. Was that an antemortem wound, in your opinion?
Yes, it was.
Now, doctor, with reference to the stab wound that you have numbered as stab wound number 2 on the right side of Mr. Goldman's body, would you describe that wound for us, please?
That was on the right side of the chest. Actually close to stab wound number 1. And this wound measured 1.5 inches in length on the skin, diagonally oriented. This also had the characteristic of a dull or blunt end and a pointed or a tapered end, which again is consistent with a single-edged blade. And this wound also penetrated the chest through the rib cage, and this wound path was close to the wound path of stab wound number 1, with bleeding along the wound path, and it also went through the lower part of the right lung, creating a perforating injury. And again, there was hemorrhage along the wound path and the blood in the pleural cavity.
Indicating that this was a wound inflicted while Mr. Goldman was alive, isn't that right?
Yes.
Was this wound fatal?
Yes, because of the perforation of the lung and the associated hemothorax.
Now, doctor, there's a third wound that is depicted on the figure, the left-hand side of Peoples 30 for identification. That was a stab wound to the right flank, was it not?
Yes.
And that had a length of approximately 3/8 inches and a depth of penetration only into the skin and underlying tissue, is that correct?
Yes, that was a superficial wound. It did not penetrate the chest or abdomen.
Was it an antemortem wound, in your opinion?
Yes.
Doctor, with regard to the figure at the right side of the diagram marked Peoples 30 for identification, there appears to be a wound to the left thigh indicated on the diagram. Is that correct?
Yes.
And did you detect and observe such a wound upon the body of Ronald Goldman when you performed the autopsy?
Yes.
And would you describe that wound, please?
This was a stab wound of the lateral outside aspect of the left thigh, 2 1/8 inches in length, and there was a blunt or dull end seam, 1/32 of an inch, and the wound path was through the skin into the muscle of the thigh with bleeding along the wound path. The depth of penetration was approximately 3-3.5 inches.
Meaning 3 to 3.5 inches?
Yes.
And from your testimony, sir, I would infer that this was a wound that you would characterize as antemortem. Is that correct?
Yes, there was bleeding along the wound path and the tissue spaces, yes.
With regard to what you observed in connection with this particular wound, would you characterize this wound as one consistent with having been inflicted by a single-edged knife?
Now, this wound did have the characteristic rounded or dull end that would be characteristic of a single-edged blade. Yes, it would.
Doctor, during the course of the autopsy involving Mr. Goldman's body, you detected a wound to the left side abdomen of Mr. Goldman, did you not?
Yes?
And, Your Honor, I have here one last diagram depicting the described wound to the left side abdomen of Mr. Goldman. May this be 31 for identification?
Yes.
Doctor, with reference to the wound as depicted on the rightmost figure on this diagram of Peoples 31 for identification, would you describe that wound for us, please?
Okay, and I'm referring to my report to refresh my recollection. This is a stab wound of the left flank below the rib cage, and it was 3/4 of an inch in length. This wound did not have a blunt or squared off end. It was, one end was pointed or tapered, the opposite end was forked or split. And then going through this wound penetrated into the body wall and passed through the muscle, the iliopsoas muscle, with bleeding along the way, and then going from back to front, the wound path ended in the abdominal aorta, where two perforating stab wounds were evident. So the wound terminated in the abdominal aorta with two perforating wounds.
In other words, the abdominal aorta was perforated, is that correct?
Yes.
What was the apparent depth of the wound?
Measured from the outside of the body wall to the termination in the aorta was approximately 5.5 inches.
Was this wound fatal in and of itself?
Yes, this perforated the aorta. There was hemorrhage along the wound path, and there was bleeding inside the body cavity, the peritoneal cavity.
Doctor, not depicted on any diagram identified thus far, was there a stab wound to the upper right chest over the right clavicle? Do you recall that one?
Yes, and yes, it's not on this diagram. It's in my report.
And that was a
This
superficial
is
wound?
a superficially oriented wound, 1/2 inch in length, involving the skin and subcutaneous tissue. Again, it was split or forked on one end, pointed or tapered on the other end, with a small amount of hemorrhage. Again, cannot tell from this wound whether it was caused by a single or double-edged
You
blade.
were able to determine, were you not, that this was an antemortem wound?
Yes, there was a small amount of fresh bleeding associated, so it was an antemortem wound.
Dr. Golden, earlier in your testimony today, you have described for us what are known as defense wounds. Did you see any indicia of defense wounds on Mr. Goldman's body?
Yes.
In general, would you describe what you observed in that regard?
He had cutting wounds on the right hand and on the left hand. And specifically, there were cutting wounds on the palm of the right hand, at the base of the index finger, palmar surface of the right hand, at the web of the thumb, palmar surface of the right hand, near the web of the thumb, palmar surface of the left hand, at the web of the thumb, and on the addendum report, specifically on the palmar surface of the left hand, there was a superficial cutting wound. So I believe that characterizes the main sharp force or cutting injuries
Your
on
Honor,
his hands.
I have here two photographs. People's 29 for identification, with the court's permission, depicts the
I'm sorry,
palms.
People's 29?
I'm sorry,
We're up to
32.
31.
Yes. And that, the photograph bears a coroner's tag and appears to depict the right palm of the decedent. And then People's 33 for identification, Your Honor, similar photograph depicting what appears to be the left palm of the decedent, Ronald Goldman. It too also bears a coroner's evidence tag, which corresponds to the case number assigned to Mr. Goldman's autopsy. May these be so marked for
Yes.
identification? Dr. Goldman, I'm going to hand you first People's 32 for identification and ask that you observe that in discrete fashion. Sir, does that photograph depict the sharper incised wounds that you've described in your testimony as defense wounds to the right palm of Mr. Goldman's hand?
Yes?
Was that a photo taken during Mr. Goldman's autopsy?
Yes?
With regard to People's 33 for identification, would you tell us what that depicts, sir? That is the photograph that
That's
is
the
now
palm.
face down on the witness stand before you. What does that photograph depict, sir?
That is the left hand of the decedent, palmar surface.
Does that photograph truly and accurately depict the defense wounds to the left palm of Mr. Goldman's hands that you've described thus far in your testimony?
Yes?
Dr. Golden, in addition to the wounds depicted in People's 32 and 33 for identification, Did you observe what might be characterized as other defense wounds to the back of Mr. Goldman's hands as well as to his forearms?
Yes.
And in general and in brief, how would you characterize those wounds?
Basically, there are multiple abrasions involving the forearm, including the outer or lateral aspect of the forearm where there are multiple abrasions. That means scratches. Some were not scratches. They were irregular in configuration. On the top of the hand, there were fresh bruises, abrasions on the knuckles, and I went into detail on which fingers and which knuckles there are abrasions, bruises on the various knuckles and fingers of the right hand. On the top or dorsal surface of the left hand, there were multiple red-brown abrasions involving the knuckles of the index finger, and then there were also multiple irregularly configured abrasions on the knuckle of the middle finger. There was also a fresh bruise, about 1 1/4 by 1 1/2 inches on the top of the left hand, adjacent to the wrist, and fresh bruises on the ulnar surface of the left wrist, which means on the, I guess you'd say, the inner surface of the left wrist. And on the addendum report, there were a few additional abrasions on the fingers, the fingers of the left hand, middle finger, left hand, fifth finger, and on the distal portion of the left thumb. So basically, there were a number of abrasions and bruises, many on the top or knuckles of the fingers and on the top of the hand.
All compatible with defense wounds, in your opinion?
Well, yes, or arising during a struggle.
Dr. Golden, at the conclusion of your autopsy, did you form an opinion as to the cause of Ronald Goldman's death?
Yes.
And what was your opinion?
He died as a result of the multiple sharp injuries, which included the cutting wound of the left side of the neck, which severed or transected the left internal jugular vein, and the 2 stab wounds of the right side of the chest, which perforated the thorax and right lung, and the stab wound of the left side of the abdomen, which perforated the abdominal aorta.
A few more questions, sir, if I may.
Yes.
Dr. Golden, during each of these autopsies, were the investigating officers from the Los Angeles Police Department present?
Yes.
And by that I mean specifically, were Detectives Phil Van Adder and Tom Lang present during each of the autopsies?
Yes.
Sir, with regard to the autopsy performed on Nicole Brown Simpson's body, did you take a blood sample for purposes of serological study?
Yes.
And was that particular blood sample placed in a test tube bearing Nicole Brown Simpson's name and the applicable coroner's case number?
Yes.
Was the same procedure followed with regard to the taking of a blood sample from Ronald Goldman's body?
Yes.
And were those blood samples later delivered into the custody of Detective Van Adder?
Yes.
Dr. Golden, on June the 15th, 1994, were you visited at the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office by Detective Phil Van Adder?
Yes.
On that date, sir, did Detective Van Adder show you a knife?
Yes.
Describe what you recall about the knife that was shown to you by Detective Van Adder.
It was a folding knife with a blade approximately 6 inches long.
And describe what happened when Detective Van Adder showed you that knife.
Well, he wanted to know if that knife was consistent or compatible with the wounds that I saw inflicted on either individual, and whether it was compatible with some of the wounds inflicted on either individual.
And did you provide Detective Van Adder with an answer?
I said it could. Yes, I did.
And what was your answer?
I said it could have been the weapon. Yes, that inflicted some of the wounds.
Now, you examined the knife. Is that correct?
Cursorily, yes. I measure the length of the. I measure the length and the width of the blade.
Now, is your opinion that a knife such as that could have inflicted the wounds received by Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman definitive, or would you have liked to have done something more with regard to examination of the knife to determine more precisely?
It was not definitive. I'd like to do a lot more.
Like what?
Well, make detailed measurements of the blade, correlating each wound that I described, specifically each stab wound that I described in my protocol, with measurements of the blade of the instrument.
To date, sir, have you had the opportunity to conduct such an examination?
No, I haven't.
So your opinion then is, with regard to the knife displayed to you by Detective Van Adder, that it could have inflicted the wounds upon Mr. Goldman's body and upon Nicole Brown Simpson's body, but not necessarily so. Is that correct?
Not necessarily so. To be scientific, I would have to get my little white ruler out that I use for measuring the wounds on the body and do the same thing on the knife.
Okay. May I have a moment, John?
Yes.
No further questions.
It's about 5 minutes to 12. Which of you is going to cross-examine the witness? Okay. I think we'll break at this point, and we'll start with your cross-examination at 1:30. I would like to see counsel briefly in chambers.